You loved differently, not with flowers or flattery, but with presence, with attention, with a kind of stillness that made her feel seen, and it scared her. You weren't the loudest man in the room. You weren't the most charming, but you felt things deeply. You noticed the shift in her tone before she spoke. You heard what she didn't say. You stayed when she crumbled, not to fix her, but to witness her. And for a while, that presence felt sacred, until it didn't, until she started calling you too much, too intense, too too quiet, too unavailable in the wrong ways. And slowly, you saw it happen again. She withdrew, not with rage, but with indifference. The conversations got shallow, the spark got buried, and the version of you that showed up with full depth was pushed to the side. You were misunderstood, not because you were broken, but because you didn't play the role. You didn't entertain. You didn't flatter endlessly. You didn't shrink your thoughts to fit the moment. You were real, and real is uncomfortable. Real doesn't fit the romantic fantasy. Real reveals. And what it revealed in her was not awe, but fear. Fear of being known too well. Fear of losing control. Fear of being mirrored back something honest. And so she left. Or maybe worse, she stayed, but stopped seeing you. You were no longer intriguing. You were overwhelming. And that's the wound. Not that you were rejected, but that you were rejected for your depth. They said, be open, be authentic, be emotionally available. But when you showed up that way, they called it too heavy, too much to hold, too serious for where I'm at right now. So now you sit with a silence you didn't choose, a solitude that's not empty, just tired. Tired of being read incorrectly, tired of being asked to explain what can't be simplified, tired of dimming your light, so no one feels blind. You are not broken. You are not wrong. You are simply deep, in a world that has grown addicted to the shallow. Mirror question. When did your depth first feel like a burden to someone you loved? They told you to be yourself, to speak your truth, to feel without shame. And so you did. You brought your full presence, your complex thoughts, your quiet intensity, and they recoiled, not always with words, but with withdrawal, with distraction, with discomfort. Soothingly, you were too quiet, too serious, hard to read, too much in your head. But what they really meant was, you were too deep for the surface-level connections they were used to. You weren't built for casual. You weren't wired for performance. You didn't play the game of emotional entertainment. You felt. And in this culture, that's a liability. Because somewhere along the way, depth became a threat. Vulnerability became weakness. Stillness became suspicious. You were told that sensitivity is noble. But when you showed it, they asked you to relax. You were told honesty is attractive. But when you spoke truth, it ruined the mood. You were told to communicate. But when you did, you were overthinking. They lied. What they wanted wasn't truth. It was comfort. A curated version of you that made them feel safe, not challenged, not exposed. Because a deep man doesn't just feel, he reveals. He reveals the fakeness of their curated image, the cracks in their logic, the emptiness in their distractions. You didn't push them away. Your presence pulled their masks off, and they weren't ready for that. So they left. Or worse, they tried to shrink you, tried to make you fun, less intense, more laid back. They tried to clip your wings so they could breathe easier around your height. And here's what hurts the most. You believed them. You started hiding your thoughts, laughing at jokes you didn't find funny, pretending silence didn't comfort you, acting as if chill was your native language when it never was. Because they told you, be less and you'll be loved more. But that's not love. That's management. You were being managed. Fit into a version small enough to date, but never big enough to be fully met. They didn't want to love a man. They wanted to use a mirror, one that only reflected what they wanted to see. And when you reflected more, they turned away. Not because you were wrong, but because they were unwilling to go that deep. Mirror question. What parts of yourself did you hide just to keep the connection alive? Your depth is currency, and you've been giving it away like spare change. You offer insight, presence, stillness to people who don't know how to hold it. You reveal your thoughts to those who only want validation. You feel deeply in a world that rewards speed, noise, and distraction. And when they can't match your depth, they mock it, call it too much, call you distant, hard to connect with. But let's be honest, you weren't hard to connect with. You were just expensive. Expensive in presence, in truth, in attention. And what's expensive is often rejected, not because it lacks value, but because it requires too much reflection. You gave your essence like it was free, because no one told you. Energy, especially deep emotional energy, is not a gift. It's a negotiation. You thought vulnerability meant openness at all costs, but you didn't learn the cost of opening to those who hadn't earned it. So you gave your thoughts to people who only wanted reactions. You gave your presence to people addicted to performance. You gave your soul to people who only knew how to skim the surface. And when they left, you blamed your depth. You told yourself, maybe if I were easier, lighter, simpler. But the truth is, they were never meant to hold what you offered. They came with plastic cups. You brought them oceans. Now you understand. Emotional energy must be protected, not proven. Not everyone gets access to the core. Not everyone deserves the silence that makes them reflect. Not everyone can handle being seen when they've built a life on being watched. You don't owe your insight to those who treat presence as entertainment. You don't owe your calm to people who mistake it for emptiness. You don't owe your emotional labor to anyone who hasn't earned your peace. Your depth is not the problem. Your distribution is. Because once you begin to curate your energy, they will feel the absence. And in that absence, they will recognize what they never respected when it was free. As Kahlil Gibran once said, generosity is giving more than you can, and pride is taking less than you need. But wisdom is knowing where not to give at all. Mirror question. Who did you give your depth to that only knew how to play in the shallow? It doesn't happen all at once. The collapse is quiet, incremental, a slow erosion not of self-worth, but of expression. You stop sharing that extra thought. You cut your sentences short. You feel something deeply, and you bury it before it reaches your lips. Because every time you've brought your fullness, you were met with blank stares, with shifting eyes, with words like, you're too intense, you think too much, can't you just go with the flow? So, you tried. You laughed at the things that bored you. You flirted in ways that felt hollow. You pretended that small talk didn't kill you slowly. You lowered the volume of your soul just to be invited back into the room. And what did it cost? Everything. Because, in trying to be tolerated, you became unrecognizable. To them and to yourself, you began to feel like a ghost. Not because no one saw you, but because what they saw wasn't you. You smiled, but inside, your silence screamed. You dated, but you felt lonelier next to someone than you ever did alone. You played along, but a part of you kept whispering, this isn't real. That whisper became a wound, and that wound became exhaustion, not physical, not mental, existential. Because a deep man doesn't burn out from work. He burns out from pretending. Pretending he doesn't care when she pulls away. Pretending he's okay with surface-level touch. Pretending he's not starving for depth in a culture of chill. And so, he collapses, not into rage, but into withdrawal. Not because he's weak, but because he's done explaining his depth to people committed to misunderstanding it. That's the breaking point. When being misunderstood becomes more painful than being alone. So he goes quiet. Not as a game, not as revenge, but as protection. Because at some point, he realizes his depth is not meant for everyone. And silence is not loneliness. It's filtration. He's not lost. He's choosing to stop offering full oceans to people who can't swim. Mirror question. How much of yourself have you silenced just to avoid being misread? Something changed. Not on the surface, but deep beneath it. No one noticed, because no one was really looking. But inside, the storm stopped raging. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped feeding it. You stopped asking to be understood. You stopped trying to translate your soul into a language that could be consumed casually. You stopped hoping someone would finally say, "I see you," because you realized most people don't want to see. They want to feel good. And depth rarely feels good. At first, it challenges, it confronts, it unmasks. And so, it's often rejected. You've spent years trying to make your depth palatable. Now, you wear it like armor. Quiet, heavy, sacred. You don't overshare anymore. Not out of fear, but out of respect for your own energy. You don't explain your pauses. You don't apologize for silence. You don't chase people who only want the surface of you, but flinch when they glimpse the abyss. This is the Stoic shift. Not the death of emotion, but the birth of discipline. You've turned your sensitivity inward. You've reclaimed your stillness as power. You've accepted that most will never understand what you carry. And that's okay, because you no longer need to be decoded. You no longer need permission to feel fully, or to say nothing at all. You walk differently now. Not faster, not louder, just heavier, with presence, with discernment. You don't speak to be heard. You speak when it matters. You don't show up everywhere. You show up where your presence is earned. You're not cold. You're measured, not aloof, anchored. Because the man who used to beg for resonance now lives inside his own. And when someone shallow enters your space, you don't get angry. You don't try to convert them. You just observe it, quietly, from a distance. As Epictetus said, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. You have become. Now you do. Not with noise, not with performance, but with quiet strength that only those with depth can recognize. And that's enough. Not everyone will get it. Not everyone is meant to. Because this kind of presence isn't meant to be popular. It's meant to be felt, in silence, in stillness, in moments that don't ask for words. This is the shift. The moment you stop bleeding to be known and start breathing just to be whole. Mirror question. What changed when you stopped needing to be seen and started living for what's real? You stopped trying. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally realized caring without discernment is self-harm. You used to offer your emotional world like a gift, delicate, unwrapped, sincere, and they took it like background music. Pleasant, but forgettable. So now you detach. Not as punishment, not as a performance, but as discipline. Because emotional detachment isn't the absence of feeling, it's the mastery of feeling. It's when you no longer pour yourself into vessels that leak, when you no longer speak into ears that only hear themselves, when you no longer chase connection that only exists when you carry the full weight. You've learned that silence is cleaner than begging, that distance is kinder than explaining, that protecting your depth is more important than performing it for those who aren't ready. This is not numbness. This is wisdom. You still feel deeply, but now you don't share indiscriminately. You don't offer insight to be praised. You don't soften your tone so they stay. You watch. You measure. You protect. Because you understand, every time you give your emotional presence to someone unready, you fracture yourself. You're not bitter. You're just done donating your truth to people who only want decoration. And now, when someone says, "You've changed," you smile. Because yes, you have. You've changed from a man who gave freely to a man who gives wisely. From a man who needed to be heard to a man who's fine being silent. From a man who opened to everyone to a man who only opens to depth. That's detachment. not as escape, but as evolution. As Krishnamurti wrote, to be free is not to deny attachment, but to see it clearly and to walk without it. Now you walk alone, not in loneliness, but in sovereignty, because no one can misuse what they can't access, and your access is no longer public. Mirror question. When did detachment stop being a defense and start becoming your discipline? They don't notice at first. They think your silence is temporary, a phase, maybe even a tactic. But it isn't. It's a decision. You didn't go quiet to get attention. You went quiet because no one knew what to do with your voice. You stopped showing up in conversations that never left the surface. Stopped pouring presence into people who only wanted stimulation. Stopped translating your depth into simpler words for their comfort. And slowly, they feel it. Not just your silence, but the absence of gravity. Because when a deep man leaves, he doesn't leave noise behind. He leaves emptiness, a void that's not loud but undeniable. A stillness that haunts, because it reflects everything they couldn't handle when it was present. They scroll through conversations that used to be effortless and realize none of them mean anything. They think back to the way you listened, the way you saw them, and realize no one has done it since. Your absence becomes a mirror, one that reveals how shallow everything around them feels now, how replaceable the attention is, how rare the connection was, because what they once called too serious now feels like clarity. What they once said was too much now feels like substance. What they once rejected, they now miss. Quietly, regretfully, too late. You don't gloat. You don't return. You don't say, I told you so, because the man you are now has no interest in being resuscitated by the same hands that once let him drown. You've become still, selective, protected, and that is the most haunting kind of presence, the one that refuses to perform, but never needed to. They try to circle back, check in, ask how you're doing, but they don't realize the version of you they knew only existed because you kept softening to stay, and he's gone. Now, they feel the chill of distance, not as punishment, but as balance. You were fire. They played with it. Now you are frost, and they can't light a spark with hands that never learned to hold warmth. As Kahlil Gibran wrote, ever has it been that love knows not its own depth until the hour of separation. Now, in your absence, they finally feel what your presence meant. But you're not coming back, because the man who walks in silence walks forward. Mirror question. Who felt your worth only after your silence made it undeniable? You're no longer waiting for the apology, for the recognition, for someone to finally say, I understand you now. And because that version of you, the one who needed to be seen to feel solid, is gone. And in his place stands someone quieter, but unshakable. You don't raise your voice anymore, not because you've lost passion, but because your peace is now more sacred than your point. You don't need to win her over. You don't need them to circle back. You don't need the group to get it. You're not here to be gotten. You're here to be. You realize now, the deepest men are always misunderstood, because they are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be felt, and only by those with enough stillness to perceive them, only by those who have met their own depth first. That's the paradox. You had to lose them to meet you. You had to be rejected by the shallow to return to the depth that birthed you. You had to walk alone to realize you were never empty, just surrounded by people who couldn't recognize fullness. Now, you live different, not above others, but beyond the reach of shallow hooks. You love, but don't attach. You feel, but don't collapse. You give, but no longer leak. This is your freedom, not in applause, not in validation, but in the quiet understanding that you are not here to be easy. You are here to be true. And if that means being misread, so be it. If that means being walked away from, let them go. Because the man who is truly powerful no longer needs to explain his silence. He just lives it. He doesn't chase. He doesn't beg. He doesn't perform. He simply is. A presence, not a pitch. And the world will always struggle to define him. But he doesn't need to be defined. He needs to be whole. As Carl Jung once said, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. You've awakened. Now walk. In stillness, in truth, in you. Final mirror question. What if being misunderstood was just the price of finally becoming real?